At the bottom of the DEI well is Jew hate. There is a language creeping into Jewish institutions that should set off alarms. Jewish identifying, female identifying, white presenting, privileged identity, oppressor, colonizer. Some of these terms appear directly in Jewish institutional language. Others come from the broader identity vocabulary now surrounding Jewish communal life. It all sounds bureaucratic and harmless, like the standard vocabulary of universities, nonprofits, foundations, and HR departments. It is not harmless. Language carries assumptions. When Jewish organizations adopt DEI language, they are not simply modernizing their vocabulary. They are importing a framework built around particular ideas about identity, power, privilege, and oppression. That framework has repeatedly shown that it does not know what to do with Jews. Once Jews are classified as powerful, privileged, white, or colonial, anti Semitism becomes easier to overlook, rationalize, and sometimes even justify. That is the danger. I am not Jewish identifying. I am not Jewish identifying. I am a Jew. Jews are a people. We have ancestry, history, religion, languages, culture, collective memory, and an ancestral homeland. Some Jews are religious and some are atheists. We are Ashkenazi, Sephardi, Mizrahi, Ethiopian, Indian, black, white, and brown. Jews can be born into the Jewish people or join the Jewish people through conversion. Jewishness does not fit neatly into the little boxes modern identity politics created, and that is exactly the problem. There are legitimate research contexts where someone might be asked whether they identify as Jewish. That is methodology. Turning Jewish identifying into ordinary language for Jews is something else entirely. It reduces an ancient people to an individualized identity category. Thousands of years of peoplehood become a selection on a form. That may sound like semantics, but it isn't. The language is already inside Jewish institutions. This is not just campus activist language anymore. Jewish institutions are adopting it too. Hadassah, the Women's Zionist Organization of America, recently advertised programming for female/female identifying high school students. Its organizational material has also described its foundation as serving all who identify as women and girls. That matters because this is Hadassah, founded in 1912 by Henrietta Sold and one of America's great Zionist Jewish institutions. To be precise, I have not seen Hadassah use the exact phrase Jewish identifying, and I am not claiming that it has. The point is that the vocabulary is already inside the building. Nor am I claiming that saying female identifying somehow causes anti Semitism. The danger is the conceptual toolkit attached to this language, one that increasingly understands human identity through categories of self identification, power, privilege, marginalization, and oppression. Once Jewish institutions begin speaking that language reflexively, they normalize categories that can later be applied to Jews themselves. Ideological capture rarely arrives with a memo announcing that a new worldview has taken over. It enters through a phrase in a style guide, a sentence in a grant application, a training seminar, a consultant, or a website rewrite. Eventually, everyone speaks the vocabulary without asking where it came from or what assumptions came attached to it. That is how a worldview becomes normal, one phrase at a time. Stanford already showed us the problem. Jewish organizations do not have to guess what can happen when identity-driven frameworks are applied to Jews. Stanford already documented the problem. In 2024, Stanford's own subcommittee on anti-Semitism and anti-Israeli bias examined an institutional culture in which identity was frequently understood through categories of privilege, power, and oppression. Its report described how Jewish identity and anti-Semitism could be minimized when Jews were viewed primarily through whiteness, and it concluded that existing DEI approaches had failed Jews and Israelis in important ways. The committee ultimately recommended moving toward a broader pluralism model, rather than continuing to organize campus inclusion primarily around identity-based DEI. That should have been a giant warning sign. This was not a conservative think tank attacking universities from the outside. It was Stanford investigating Stanford and concluding that its own approach could disadvantage Jews. Hadassah shows the vocabulary entering Jewish institutions. Stanford shows what can happen when the assumptions behind that vocabulary are applied to Jews. We should connect those dots before we institutionalize the same framework ourselves. Jews break the categories. DEI ideology tends to understand people through categories of identity and relative power, marginalized or privileged, oppressed or oppressor, colonized or colonizer, white or people of color, powerless or powerful. Then Jews walk into the room and break the machine. We are an ancient Middle Eastern people, but many American Jews have light skin. We were exiled from our ancestral homeland, but our return is called colonialism. We endured centuries of discriminatory laws, expulsions, ghettos, massacres, pogroms, and genocide, yet Jews are routinely discussed primarily through the language of privilege. We are roughly 0.2% of humanity, yet anti-Semitism has always imagined us as enormously powerful. Jewish identity can involve ancestry, religion, ethnicity, nationality, civilization, and peoplehood at the same time. The categories simply cannot handle us. So instead of questioning the categories, the framework begins rewriting the Jew. The Ashkenazi Jew becomes simply white. The successful Jew becomes privileged. The Israeli becomes colonizer. The Zionist becomes oppressor. Jewish national liberation becomes settler colonialism. Jewish fear becomes fragility, while Jewish objections become attempts to silence marginalized voices. You can say extraordinary things about Jews as long as you classify them as powerful first. That is the mechanism. DEI does not automatically produce Jew hate. It can, however, create an intellectual permission structure in which hostility toward Jews becomes easier to excuse. If Jews are powerful, hostility toward them can be reframed as resistance. If Jews are privileged, excluding them can be reframed as equity. If Israelis are colonizers, violence against them can be reframed as liberation. If Zionists are oppressors, silencing them can be reframed as protecting marginalized people. The old hatred does not disappear. It acquires a new moral vocabulary. The rules somehow change for Jews. One of the central ideas of contemporary identity politics is that marginalized groups should be allowed to define themselves. Somehow that principle becomes much less sacred when Jews try to do it. Other peoples describe an ancestral connection to a land, and outsiders are told to listen. Jews describe ours, and we are corrected. Other minorities describe discrimination, and their lived experience is treated as meaningful evidence. Jews describe anti-Semitism, and suddenly everyone becomes a forensic investigator looking for reasons it might not count. Other groups object to outsiders redefining their identity, and that is called respect. Jews object to being reduced to white colonial oppressors, and we are told that we are resisting accountability. Funny how quickly self-definition stops being sacred when the people defining themselves are Jews. This is why Jewish institutions should be especially wary of importing these categories. We already possess the language we need: peoplehood, Am Yisrael, Jewish history, Jewish civilization, Eretz Israel, diaspora, exile, return, and community. We do not need to translate ourselves into somebody else's political grammar. Words are infrastructure. Words are not decoration, they are infrastructure. Teach people to understand society primarily through oppressor and oppressed, and eventually they must decide where Jews belong. Teach them that visible whiteness is a primary measure of social power, and many Jews become simply white. Teach them that power invalidates claims of victimhood, and Jewish success becomes evidence against Jewish vulnerability. Once Jews have been assigned to the powerful side of the equation, anti-Semitism becomes harder to recognize, because the framework has already decided which direction oppression is supposed to flow. Jewish suffering becomes an inconvenience to the theory. Instead of reconsidering the theory, the suffering gets minimized. After October 7, we watched how useful this structure could become. Massacred Israelis were reduced to settlers. Kidnapped civilians were treated as representatives of colonial power. Jewish fear became manipulation. Jewish grief became propaganda. Anti-Semitism was endlessly qualified, contextualized, and explained away because the Jew had already been assigned the wrong role in the morality play. That is what makes the language dangerous. Once the vocabulary has classified the Jew as powerful, the oldest hatred becomes remarkably easy to dress up as justice. Jewish organizations should speak Jewish. Jewish institutions should stop importing ideological language simply because universities, foundations, and nonprofits have decided everyone must speak it. We do not need Jewish identifying people. We have Jews. We do not need to understand ourselves as white presenting. We are Jews. We do not need an oppressor versus oppressed spreadsheet to understand Jewish history. We have Jewish history. We do not need outside ideological systems to explain Jewish peoplehood to us. We have spent several thousand years doing that ourselves. Jewish institutions should teach Jewish history, Jewish peoplehood, Jewish diversity, and the Jewish connection to Eretz Israel. They should not translate those things into categories developed in institutions that repeatedly struggle to recognize anti-Semitism once it is dressed in progressive language. Some institutions have begun reconsidering traditional DEI models since October 7th. Good. Jewish organizations should learn from that reassessment instead of continuing to import yesterday's ideological vocabulary after its failures have become impossible to ignore. The stakes are especially high because young Jews are listening. When a Jewish institution adopts these categories, it gives them Jewish legitimacy and teaches young Jews that this is how educated and compassionate people understand the world. Then those same young Jews arrive on campus and discover where the framework places Israel, where it places Zionists, and eventually where it places them. At the bottom of the well. Diversity is good. Equal treatment is good. Including people is good. None of those things require an ideology that sorts humanity according to perceived privilege, power, and oppression. Jewish organizations should get out of the habit of borrowing language from institutions that keep misclassifying Jews. Hadassah should stop. Federations should stop. Synagogues should stop. Jewish schools should stop. Stop describing Jews using categories created by people who cannot figure out what Jews are. Stop importing frameworks that erase Jewish peoplehood, Jewish indigeneity, and Jewish history. Stop teaching Jews to see themselves through an ideological system that somehow keeps finding them guilty at the end of the equation. We already have a word for Jewish identifying people. Jews, use it. You do not have to swallow an ideology whole for it to change how you think. Sometimes it enters through the vocabulary, and if Jewish organizations keep lowering the bucket into the DEI well, they should not be surprised by what eventually comes back up. Jew hate. If you enjoy my writing, support me by buying my book, Screaming into the Void, available on paperback or Kindle on Amazon.com.